All right, Rabbi, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors, our sponsors for this morning's shir. I'm sorry to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat. To thank Mrs. Bracha Strimber for dedicating all the Shurm and Drashos this month in loving memory of her husband, Avi Strimber, Avraham ben Kallman Eلیعزر Halevi. An anonymous Day of Learning sponsor in the merit of a refuah shleima for Rena Esther bas Yaffa Gita. Should have a refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And also with that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Chaf Beis 22, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis 21b, and we are picking up, I believe we left off yesterday, 6 lines up from the bottom, right at the 2 dots. Ein pochesin mehen ve'ein mosifim. So the citation here from the Mishnah is that on certain of these days, pretty much any day other than Shabbos, we don't add on to the number of aliyos, and we don't go ahead and subtract. So it says the Gemara Tana, haposeach mevarech lefanao, v'chosim mevarech lacharao. So remember again, the Mishnah also espoused a very interesting model, which was that the person who got the first aliyah made the bracha before the aliyah shebach rabanu, and the person who got the last aliyah went ahead and made the bracha of asher nasalanu after the aliyah. There were no other brachos made over the course of Kriyas HaTorah. So says the Gemara, Va'idna tikolhu mevarchi lefanao la'achareha. So what about now? So both say, obviously at some point in time, this practice changed. Now when exactly it changed, the Gemara doesn't tell us. But Lamaisa, we know that it changed. We know that it changed. So the Gemara says, now we make a bracha before and after every aliyah. So what's the pshat? Va'ina dekulim mevarchi lefanao la'achara hainu taima titakinu rabbanon gezerah mishum hanichnasin u'mishum hayotzin. So we'll say this is fascinating. Why do we make a bracha before and after every aliyah? This was a gezerah, an enactment made because of those who come late and those who leave early. What are we concerned about? We'll say, think about this in just a moment. If all I'm doing is making a bracha before I go ahead and enter. Let's like this. If all I'm doing is making a bracha before the first aliyah, let's say someone comes late. Now we're talking really late, right? So a person comes into shul after the first aliyah, they never end up hearing the bracha of Asher Bachabanu. And they could erroneously assume that we do not make a bracha before Kriyas HaTorah. Similarly, if a person leaves early before laning is over, you could have a situation where a person never hears Asher Nasan Lanu, and therefore would erroneously assume that we do not make a bracha after Kriyas HaTorah. Take a look at Rashi. Bishuman Nichnasin Shemikanis Adon Leveis HaKnesses Achar Shebeirach Rishon. If a person will come into shul after the first aliyah, ve'im lo yishma es ha'achirim mevarchin yomar ein bracha baTorah lefanao. Umishum hayotzin, same idea. V'lo shamu es ha'chosim mevarch la'achareh v'arishonim lo baruchu yomru hayotzim ein bracha baTorah la'achareh. So we'll say it's really very interesting that you also see something amazing. You know, we take it for granted that knowledge is accessible wherever we want it, right? If we don't know something, you can always Google it, right? You can look up anything anywhere. The Gemara is highlighting over here the reality of the access of knowledge. So the common man gleaned his knowledge based on what he saw. So if I come into shul late, and obviously this is someone who is a habitual offender, I'm coming into shul late all of the time, I'm missing the first aliyah. So halacha l'maisa, again, I can easily begin to think there's no bracha before Kriyas HaTorah. I habitually leave early. I can end up thinking there's no bracha after Kriyas HaTorah. Therefore, in order to avoid this, halacha l'maisa, Chazal said, make a bracha before and after each aliyah. Quite fascinating. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara is incredible. The halacha l'maisa sugya. Watch this. B'Rosh Chodesh v'Chol Shamoid Karn Arba. On Rosh Chodesh, on Chol Hamoed, we read 4 aliyos. 4 aliyos, amazing, right? What timing of this sugya? Says the Gemara, B'Minei Ula Barav Meirava. Parshas Rosh Chodesh Ketzad Koronos. So we'll say, isn't this incredible? The Parsha of Rosh Chodesh, how do we read it? Well, what's the problem? Tzavis b'nei Yisrael v'yamar ta'alem is kavani lochmi dahavyon tamnya psuki. Well, see, here's the problem. The actual Parsha of Rosh Chodesh is a psukim. So what should we do? Hechi navid Nikri trey tlasa psukim pashul trey. But remember again, if you take an 8 pasuk paragraph and divide it up 3 ways, what do you get? 3, 3, 2. Well, that doesn't work. But there's actually 2 problems with that. Problem number 1 is we never leave over in a paragraph less than 3 psukim, excuse me. So the problem is you couldn't end sheni where you end sheni because that's leaving over less than 3 psukim. And what's the other problem? You don't do an aliyah less than what? 3 psukim. Okay. Nikri arba Vashaluhu Shiva. So if ultimately, again, if you go ahead and read 4 and 4 and enter into the next paragraph, ultimately, again, you could end up with 7. Ubiyom Shabbos Havyin Trey, Ubarashei Chadashim Havyin Chamisha. So what should we do? So remember again, so therefore the easiest thing to do is obviously go into the following paragraphs in the Torah. So how should we structure this? Hechi Navid, Nikri Trey Meha, V'chad Mehanach. So maybe we'll read. So 2 psukim from the next paragraph, and 1 pasuk from the paragraph after. Top of Chafez. Ein maschilin beparsha pachos mishlosha psukim. We never begin a paragraph unless, of course, you're going to read 3 psukim from that paragraph. So the Gemara says, so likri shremeha tlasa mehach. So go ahead and read 2 from this paragraph and 3 from the following paragraph. Pashalu Trey. The problem is then you're going to end up what? Leaving over 2 in the 3rd paragraph. So we'll say, so therefore again we're going to run into the same problem. So interestingly enough, the Gemara is dealing with how do we properly structure the Kriyas HaTorah for Rosh Chodesh when you don't seem to have a number of psukim that fit well into 4 aliyos. So the Gemara says, Amar Zulo Shamati, Kiyotse Shamati. So remember again, this became a question from Ula from Rava. So remember again, so Ula says, or I should say Rava says, Ula asks question from Rava. So Rava responds, I don't know the answer to your question, but I heard something similar. So Rava said, listen to this. Both we just had this in Maseches Tainis. Disnan, Bayom Harishon, Bereshis, Vayirakia. Both remember again in the Ma'amados, the groups of Yisraelim who gathered in their respective cities, who did not ascend to Yerushalayim, going with the approach that some Yisraelim went with the Kohanim and Levim to Yerushalayim, and others remained behind in select cities. Remember, each and every day they would read. They had a Torah reading. What would they read? From Maaseh Bereshis. So again, on the first day, Bayom Rishon, Bereshis Vayhirakia. On the first day of the Ma'amados, they would read the section of Bayom Rishon, right, to Vayhirakia. The Tani Allah, so let's analyze this. Bereshis Bishnayim, they would read the paragraph of Bereshis, and they would allocate that amongst 2 different aliyos. Yehirakia be'echad. And Yehirakia would be 1 ola, 1 aliyah. So also say the Gemara says, Va'avinaba. This is all just a quote from Tainis. Va'avinaba. We asked on that. Bishlama Yehirakia be'echad. I understand that ultimately, again, you could do Va'hirakia with 1 ola, titlasa psuki havu. Because the section of Va'hirakia, right, the creation of the Rakia, is 3 aliyos. That lends itself perfectly to 1 aliyah. Ela bereshis b'shnayim chamisha psuki havu. I will say, how can you divide up the section of Bereshis between 2 aliyos when it's only 5 psukim? To which the Gemara says, V'tanya, hakori b'Torah, lo yivchos mishlosha psukim. And obviously we learned that in general, whenever you have an aliyah is never less than 3 psukim. So I will say, if you can ever go ahead and read an aliyah less than 3 psukim, so how do you take a section that has 5 psukim and divide it amongst 2 olim? To which the Gemara says, Ve'itmar Allah. Listen to this. So we said about this. How do we explain this? Rav Amar Doleg Ushmuel Amar Posek. You both remember this machlokas? So Rav said Doleg. Now Doleg literally means skip. But in this context, what does it mean? Repeat. No problem. So we'll say what we do is, for Ola number 1 in Bereshis, we'll read Pasek Aleph Beis Gimel. Great. And then for Ola number 2, what are we going to read? Gimel Dalit Hey. So we'll repeat Pasek Gimel twice. allocating it once to the first aliyah, and then a second time to the second aliyah. So that's Rav. So ultimately, again, Shmuel Amar Posek. So ultimately, again, Shmuel says, no, what do? You actually take Pasuk Gimel Posek. What do? Split it in half. Or it doesn't have to be Pasuk Gimel. You take one of the Psukim, and you'll split it in half, thereby making it into two, which effectively means you make a 5 Pasuk paragraph into what? 6 Psukim. Good. So Rav Amar Doleg my time Amar Posek. So Rav, who says that you repeat, why doesn't he say that you go ahead and split it in half? So we've seen this before. Kasavar kol psuka de lo paski Moshe ana lo paskinon. Because ultimately, again, he held that halacha lamaisa, any pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu did not split, we do not split. We do not split. So the Gemara says, we spoke about this, by the way, in Maseches Tainus. I think did I mention there? This is why some have a little bit of a reservation by Shabbos by Shabbos day Kiddush. I think I mentioned this, right? Al Kin Beirach, right? Al Kin Beirach. So again, there's a whole discussion there again about the ability to go ahead and split up a pasuk like that. Okay, so the Gemara says as follows. So Shmuel, so therefore Rav would rather say we repeat a pasuk rather than go ahead and split a pasuk, because any pasuk that Moshe Rabbeinu did not split, we don't split either. We don't split either. Shmuel says paskin alei. So the Gemara says, so the Shmuel really say that you could split psukim. So the Gemara says, Vaha Amarav Chanina Kra. The both say all of this is a literal quote from Tainus. We literally just had this Gemara. So the Gemara says, so Amarav Chanina Kra. So Rabbi Chanina, who was a teacher of psukim, he said as follows: Tsar Gadol Hayali Eitzel Rabbi Chanina HaGadol. I had a big tsar, right? I had a big problem by Rabbi Chanina HaGadol. Why? Velo hiterli lifsok ela litinoko shel beis rabban hoel ule islami dasuyin. And what happens? So we'll say, listen to this. So Rabbi Chanina, the teacher of Psukim said, I was teaching Psukim, and ultimately again, Rabbi Chanina HaGadol would give me incredible difficulty about breaking up Psukim, and the only time he would allow me to do it was where? In order to teach children. Right? Ho'elu Islami Rasuyim. To which the Gemara says, Hasam Taimamai. Why is it that Rabbi Chanina Kra was permitted to go ahead and split Psukim in their non-Moshe Rabbeinu split ways in order to teach children? Mishum de lo efshar. Because ultimately, again, there was no other way. In other words, we'll say when teaching children, you can't teach them the whole pasuk at once. In order to teach them, you need to break it up into more digestible parts. Hachanami lo efshar. So too by the ma'amados. By the ma'amados, there's no other way. Because let's remember again, by the ma'amados, you have 3 aliyos, and you need to make 2 aliyos out of a 5 pasuk paragraph. So the only way to make 2 aliyos out of a 5 pasuk paragraph is how? Well, you have 2 choices. You could either repeat or you could split. So Rav says, I'd rather split. Or Shmuel says, I'd rather split. Right? Yeah. Shmuel says, I'd rather split. And again, so it's like, even though we normally say that you're not allowed to split, the exception to that rule is when? When there's no other option. When there's no other option. So from Shmuel's perspective, the same way we could split up the psukim in order to teach children because there's no other option, so too again over here by the ma'amados, you can go ahead and split the pasuk because there is no other option. Ayu Shmuel Amar Posek, my time Allah Amar Doleg. So Shmuel, who says that you could split the pasuk, why doesn't he say that you can go? Why doesn't he agree with Rav that you could repeat it? Listen to this. Mishuma nechnasim mishuma yotzin. They both say this is fascinating how much latecomers and early leavers drive halacha, right? It's fascinating. It's 2 examples, literally. It's fascinating because again, human nature is human nature. So what you see over here is, so Shmuel's concerned like this. Shmuel's concerned that if you repeat psukim, both say, what's going to happen? Let's play this out. Reuven comes late to shul, right? And Reuven comes at the beginning of the second aliyah for the ma'amados. What is Reuven going to see? Where are you starting the second aliyah? Where are you starting it? Right? Pasuk, really you're starting it where? Pasuk Gimel. Right? Pasuk Gimel. Now if you're Reuven, really starting Pasuk Gimel, so Reuven is going to draw what conclusion? Which is what? Rishon read what? 2 psukim. And Reuven is going to walk away with the erroneous conclusion that halacha l'maisa, you could read 2 psukim ultimately again for an aliyah, which also tells you something absolutely amazing, which is what? People often draw conclusions and never what? Never bother to ask. Right? Rarely bother to actually find out what the real situation is. It's just human nature. We glean our conclusions based on what we see, and we assume that we have all the information at hand to reach conclusions. Like, we'll say, this is so simple. Instead of, why don't we say, Reuben's going to walk in, he's going to see that at Sheni they're starting at Pasuk Gimel. He's going to say, hey, Shimon, what's going on over here? And Shimon's going to say, no, we paskin like Rav, and it's dolig, we're repeating. No, he's not going to do that. Instead, human nature is, I know everything, right? What I see is everything I need to know in order to reach my conclusions. And what did Chazal teach us? When you rely on simply what you see to draw all of your life conclusions, one thing is absolutely certain, which is you will make dramatic mistakes. And I just want to point out, this is now the second time we're seeing this. So Chazal instituted that we're going to make brachas before every aliyah and after every aliyah. Why? Someone walks in late, they missed the first Asher B'Chabanu, they're going to draw the conclusion, we don't make a bracha before we read the Torah. Or someone's going to leave early, before the last Asher Nasan Lanu, we don't make brachas after we read the Torah. Why don't we assume people are going to ask? Why not assume people are going to ask what the halacha is? This looks so strange. Again, human nature is, we draw our conclusions based on what we see, and we assume that what we see is enough to form an informed opinion. And yet we see clearly from the Gemara how untrue, how false that is, yet many of us do it each and every day. What an incredible Musar Haskell. What you see is not necessarily what you get. And when we see something, especially if it looks a little bit strange, before we form an opinion about another person, or before we form an opinion about a situation, or before we formulate a hashkafa, or an idea, or a halacha based on what we see, take the time to make sure that what you're seeing is actual MS. Such an incredible yisod. So the Gemara says, Meisvei. So therefore I will say, what's coming out over here is as follows. So just remember, our topic over here is incredible. What do I do about Rosh Chodesh? What do I do about Rosh Chodesh? Because the section of Rosh Chodesh only has 5 psukim. I need to make that into 2 aliyahs. So what am I doing? So we'll say, so again, there are 2 options. The options, again, have been espoused already by the Ma'amados. Again, Machlokes, Rav and Shmuel. I can split a pasuk, or I can repeat a pasuk, right? I can do either one. So says the Gemara, Meisvei, so the Gemara is the Kasha, Parsha Shal Shisha Psukim Karna Sabishnayim. So we'll say now the Gemara just espouses a general rule. What's the general rule? If you have a parsha that's made up of 6 psukim, you could split it into 2 aliyahs. Right? Good. V'shal chamisha psukim, yachid korerish, v'shal chamisha psukim, and it will say, what happens if you have a paragraph of 5 psukim? What do you do then? So the Gemara says, v'shal chamisha psukim, b'yachid kara rishon shlosha, hasheni kora shleima parsha zu, ve'echad parsha acheres. So we'll say, what can you do? So we'll say, if you only have 5, let the first Ola read 3 psukim. Let the second aliyah, read the 2 remaining from Parsha A. And what? Take one. We'll say, here's the good news. There's always more Torah. Right? There's always more Torah. It's not like we've reached the end of the line with psukim. Right? Unless you're over here at the end of Zos HaBracha, there's always more. So just take a pasuk from the next paragraph and finish out the requisite number of psukim. Now, we'll say, here's the problem. The Yesh Omrim, Shlosha. No, the Yesh Omrim say, yes, you could begin the next paragraph. In other words, I will say, so if you have a section of 5 psukim, so you could therefore allocate 3 psukim to the first ola. Now for the second ola, you can have a problem because you only have 2 psukim left in paragraph A. You could go ahead and begin we could begin paragraph B, but the Yesh Omrim say you have to read at least 3 psukim in paragraph B, because you cannot begin a new section of Torah and only read 1 pasuk. There is a 3 pasuk minimum. So it's going to turn out that Ola number 2 is going to have an aliyah comprised of how many psukim? 5. But that's okay. But that allows you ultimately, again, to have proper aliyos. So v'yesh omrim shlosha. You could begin the second paragraph, but you have to read at least 3 psukim. Lefi she'in maschilin b'parsha pachos mishlosha psukim. Because whenever you begin a new parsha in the Torah, you must read a minimum of 3 psukim in that new section. V'im isa. I don't say, says the Gemara, the Yesh Omrim make it sound like there's only one option over here, to begin a new paragraph and read 3 new psukim. It's not true. V'im isa l'man damar doleg nidlok u'leman damar posek nifsok. Why does the Brisa leave out Rav and Shmuel? There's another option on both sides. If you have a paragraph that only has 5 psukim, and you need to squeeze 2 aliyahs out of 5 psukim, there are options. What are your options? It's a machlokes. You could repeat one pasuk, right? Read Aleph Beis Gimel for Ola number 1, and then read Gimel Dalet Hey for Ola number 2. You've got 6 psukim. Or other possibilities, read Aleph Beis split Gimel, right? That's 3 for number 1. Second part of Gimel Dalet Hey for Ola number 2. And you've got, so why doesn't the Brisa mention that? To which the Gemara says, Shani Hasam, the Efshar Bahachi. Shabbos said, this is very interesting. The Gemara says, here's the difference. The difference is that halacha lamaisa, it's possible. Shabbos said, the machlokes Rav and Shmuel is really predicated on a situation, or really is shaykh to a situation where you have no other options. In other words, both Rav and Shmuel are going to agree the ideal is not to split a pasuk. And the ideal is not to repeat a pasuk. The ideal is just read more. Just read more. So sometimes that's possible, sometimes that's not possible for a variety of reasons. So the Gemara is suggesting, when do you get into Doleg or Posek, Rav and Shmuel? That's when you have no other options. But when you could simply read more, then of course that's ideal. Says the Gemara, ultimately, the halacha is like the Yesh Omrim. Both say, namely, that ultimately, when you only have a parsha 5 psukim, read 3 psukim for the first ola, read the remaining 2 for the second ola, then go into the next paragraph, but you have to read a minimum of what? 3 psukim from the new paragraph. The same way that if you begin a new paragraph, you can't begin with less than 3 psukim. In other words, you can't read less than 3 psukim. Kach im shayrim beparsha pachos mishlosha psukim. So to Abosai, when you end off an aliyah, you can't end an aliyah with less than 3 psukim remaining in the paragraph. To which the Gemara says, Pshita. Uhashto maschalta de kamekel tanakama machmir yesh omrim. Bosai, in the beginning, where the Tanakama is mekel, because the Tanakama says you could begin a new paragraph, even with just 1 pasuk, yet ultimately the yesh omra machmir, shir, the machmir Tanakama, lo koshkin machmir yesh omrim. Certainly again, the shir, leaving over psukim, where the Tanakama says you can't leave over less than 3. So certainly the Yesh Omrim will be machmir as well. Mao the Tema, this is very interesting. What would you have thought? Nichnasin shchichi, yotzin lo shchichi. This is interesting. I will say you would have thought that ultimately, again, people coming in late is very early. People leaving early is unheard of, right? Why? The Gemara says, "Lo shchichi demanchi sefer Torah v'nafki." Because how could a person leave in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah when the Sefer Torah is open? I will say it's just fascinating. Coming late, that's all the time. Leaving early, that would be unheard of. Now, I want to point out what he's talking about leaving early is unheard of. He's talking about leaving in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah, right? He's not saying, there's a rumor going around that there's Ashrei Uvalatzion at the end of davening. I heard it, the Shmuel. Right? So leaving, so he's not talking about leaving early at the end, he's talking about leaving in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah. Because there is such a concept like this, of walking out while the Torah itself is open, is something that one should really avoid, not even out tefillah, but out kavod Torah. So therefore the Gemara says, coming in late, even once Kriyas HaTorah happened. So that's much more common. So that's why, again, we have to be more careful, mishum de nichnasin. But ultimately, again, if you look at Rashi says over here, so nichnasin shchichi lefichach echmiru yesh omrim b'haschala. Therefore, the yesh omrim ultimately, again, will be machmir, that you can't begin a parsha with less than 3 psukim. Because ultimately, again, people coming in late, that's shayach. But perhaps they would allow you to go ahead and leave over even less than 3 psukim, because yotzin, people leaving early, is not the shayach. Okay, to which the Gemara says, Kamash Shmala, no, Kamash Nabosai, it's common that everything happens. It's common that people leave early, it's common that people come in late, everything is Shav. Tanakama, Maishnosh Yuri Delo. So I'll say ultimately again, why is it that the Tanakama doesn't seem to be as concerned about leaving over? The Gemara, to which the Gemara says, Mishum Yotzin, because ultimately again, why is the Tanakh Machar not leave over less than 3? He says because the people who may leave early. Why doesn't he similarly therefore say you can't begin a new paragraph with less than 3 as well? Why isn't he concerned with people coming in late? Amri, listen to this. Man da'ayol shayuli shayol. One who comes in late will ask his friend. One who's leaving early is not going to ask anyone because he's on his way out. Which is what I say is quite fascinating. It doesn't appear based on everything we saw before that people coming in late are asking anyone anyway. That goes back to the sugya before of why I make a bracha before each and every aliyah. Okay. To which the Gemara says, Shalach le Rabba Breid Rabba Rav Yosef Hilchas Samai. So we'll say, so bottom line halacha. What's the halacha? Now we'll say, remember again, how did this whole discussion start? This whole discussion started because the first paragraph of Rosh Chodesh, of Kriyas of Rosh Chodesh, has 5 psukim. You'd have to divide it amongst 2 aliyos. So what do I do with it? So remember again, then the Gemara, I want to point out what happened over here. The Gemara got totally into a different discussion, which is ma'amados. Right? So remember again, by ma'amados, we have a similar situation. We have a section of 5 psukim that I need to divide up amongst 2 aliyos. So remember again, how do I deal with ma'amados? How do you deal with ma'amados? What do we say? It's a machlokes. Rav and Shmuel. Rav says doleg, Shmuel says did I say that correctly? Is it Rav and Shmuel? Rav says doleg, Shmuel says posek. Yeah. Rav says doleg, Shmuel says posek. Rav says you repeat it. Shmuel says you split it. So we'll say now when the Gemara says hilchos samai, Rashi says the Gemara is asking what's the halacha by ma'amados? To which the Gemara says hilchosa doleg. The halacha is we repeat. Ve'emtsoi doleg. And I'll say who repeats? The second aliyah. Secondly, now here's what's interesting about this. So that's ma'amados. Also, just seeing how it works by ma'amados. Meretz Hashem, we're going to have to know this when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt. So it happens by ma'amados on day 1. This is really a din by day 1, because on day 1, the first paragraph of Bereshis has 5 psukim. So the way it works by ma'amados is first aliyah, Aleph, Beis, Gimel. Second aliyah, how does second aliyah start? Gimel, Dalit, Hey. And both say, and ultimately again, so that's what it means when it says, and who repeats the pasuk? It's Emtsoi. Now Emtsoi, Rabbi say, again from our mothers, you're reading 3 aliyahs. So therefore, who's the Emtsoi? Right, aliyah number 2. So aliyah number 2 is going to say, he's going to reread pasuk Gimel. So Rabbi say, it's interesting. So some want to understand that this is the same halacha by Rosh Chodesh. Right, by Rosh Chodesh, Rabbi say, we repeat the pasuk. Now, which aliyah do we repeat the pasuk by? The second. Here's the problem. What's the problem? What's the problem? Rosh Chodesh, how many aliyahs do we read? 4. Right? So there's a whole shaila in the Rishonim how to understand Emtsoi. Right? Because obviously by 4 aliyahs is kind of hard to understand. So some understand Emtsoi just means number 2. Number 2, which is clearly how we paskin, right? But I just want to point out, isn't this incredible that we're learning this sugya on Rosh Chodesh? No, this is absolutely a 7.5-year cycle that we're learning the halacha of Kriyas Rosh Chodesh on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Absolutely amazing. But this is the halacha. Again, we're not going to, I'm just giving you a maramakom. There is a fascinating machlokes Rishonim on this, about how to understand this sugya. Because again, the maskana of the Gemara over here is by ma'amados, not by Rosh Chodesh. But clearly the post can go ahead and take this and apply this to Rosh Chodesh as well. And indeed, that is our halacha l'maaseh. The way we make a 5 pasuk paragraph into 2 aliyos is we repeat a pasuk doleg. Incredible. Let's go weiter. So by those, remember again, the Mishnah said, here's the klal, any day that has musaf, that has a musaf, whether it's a tfilas musaf, karban musaf, it's the same thing, gets an extra aliyah, has 4 aliyos. Supposed to listen to this. Iboilahu, tainis sibor bekamo. Supposed to listen to this. How many aliyahs do you read on a tainis sibor? Now, what's interesting about a tainis sibor? Does a tainis sibor, communal fast day, does it have a karban musaf? The answer is no. But it does, so to speak, have a musaf. In that what? It has additional tfilos. So the shaila is, what do you do in terms of aliyos, right? And we know we have kriyas, so we have Torah reading on a tainis sibor. So on a tainis sibor, which has an additional tefillah, but doesn't have, quote unquote, a karban musaf, What do I do in terms of aliyos on a day like that? So it says the Rabbi Kama, Rosh Chodesh Umoed Dikar Karban Musaf Arba. So on one hand you have Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed, which both have a Karban Musaf and have 4 aliyos. Aval Hacha Deleka Karban Musaf Lo. But maybe by a tiny sibor there is no Karban Musaf, and therefore Halacha Lamaisa we only read 3 aliyos. O Dilma Hach and Nami Ika Musaf Tfila. On the other hand, on Rosh Chodesh, on a tiny sibor on a communal fast day, there are additional tefillos that are said. So whether it's Anenu, whether again, Abba says, you saw back in Maseches Tainis, for the more severe fast days, you have a significantly longer Shmona Esrei. You do have a quote-unquote a Musaf Tefillah, you have a Husafa, an addition to Tefillah. So how do we deal with that? So Tashma, so the Brisa says, on Rosh Chodesh and Chalama, you're going to read 4 aliyos. Habit Tainis Sibor Gimel. Now the inference from that is that what? On a regular Tainis Sibor, I'll read 3 aliyos. Right? So we'll say on the flip side, you could say on Mondays and Thursdays, Shabbos, you can read 3 aliyos. Hat Tainis Sibor Arba. I can infer from that on the Tainis Sibor, I should read 4 aliyos. So we'll say to which the Gemara says, you're right. The truth is, it doesn't seem like you could really answer this question based on the Mishnah. So Tashma, let's analyze. So here we go. The Rav Ikla Bavel B'Tainis Sibor. Rav went to Bavel on a fast day. Kam Kara B'Sifra. He got up. He didn't get an aliyah. So the Gemara says, Pasach Baruch. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, Rav went to Bavel. He got the first aliyah. He made the bracha of Asher Bacharbanu. V'chasam, when he ended the aliyah, v'lo baruch, he did not make a bracha. Right? There was no bracha after the aliyah. Nafel kuli alman payu. Everyone else fell on their face, which sounds like over here, tachnun. V'rav lo nafal alape. And Rav did not fall on his face. So there's a lot of stuff happening over here. So to which goes 1 second, let's analyze. Michti, Rav bi Yisrael kara, my time achasam v'lo baruch. First of all, the Gemara says, Rav was a Yisrael. So b'pashtos, when Rav is getting an aliyah, which aliyah is he getting? Number 3. If that's the case, why did he not make a bracha after his aliyah? My time achasam v'lo baruch. To which the Gemara says, well, lab mishum debai lemikra achrina basrei. Oh, it must be that what? That there was a 4th aliyah. Right? So in other words, Rav got shlishi, because he's a Yisrael. It's a tiny sibor. And the reason he didn't make a bracha after his aliyah was why? Because there was someone getting an aliyah after him. So what do you see from here? Then the tiny sibor, you have 4 aliyos. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo, Rav bikahanikra, wow. Rav got the Kohen aliyah. But Rav was a Yisrael. Listen to this. Daha, Rav Huna, Kari Bekani. Because after all, again, look at Rashi, Daha, Rav Huna, Kari Bekani. B'Meseches Gimman Izakin. So we'll listen to this. It's just like Rav Huna used to get the Kohen aliyah. So we'll say there is a concept like this in halacha, that when there is an outstanding Talmud Chacham, he can get the Kohen Aliyah. Now, what are the mechanics of that? Shalom says the mechanics of it are such that the Kohanim essentially yield their right to that Aliyah to the Talmud Chacham. Now, we don't do this contemporarily, but Allah Chalamais, again, it is a possibility that there's an understanding, outstanding Torah scholar, ultimately Kohanim yield their rights. So Bishlama Rav Huna Kari B'Kohani, Dafilu Rav Ami Rabbi Asi De Kohani Chashivi Dardi Yisrael Meikav Kaifulei. So I understand Rav Huna, because even, for example, Rav Ami and Rabbi Asi, who were Kohanim, and ultimately, again, were outstanding Talmidei Chacham of Eretz Yisrael, they were subservient to Rav Huna. In other words, Rav Huna was the undisputed ranking Talmud Chacham. So it makes sense that even other Talmidei Chacham who were Kohanim would yield to him. To which the Gemara says, El Rav ha'ika Shmuel d'kohana hava v'dabra alei. So listen to this. Rav had Shmuel. Shmuel was a contemporary of Rav, and by the way, Shmuel was a Kohen. So we'll say, so b'pashtos, in other words, generationally, if you are the ranking Talmud Chacham, and halacha lamaisa, the other Kohanim of the generation are quote unquote, I'm using the word subservient, but you understand, I mean like halachically, subservient to you, then I understand. But the truth is, Rav has Shmuel is a Kohen, and Shmuel is a peer, right? Shmuel is an equal to Rav. So how could Rav take How could Rav take the coin aliyah? Rabbi, look at Rashi. Ha'ika Shmuel ben Naharda Shumi Medinas Bava Tukanav. So first of all, there's Shmuel. Shmuel was the Rav in Narda, right? And furthermore, Vidaber Iluye, Rashi says, Nog Hayalios Lamala Meirav Kedarina Perak Meruba Rav Lo Ayla Kam Shmuel. Both say Rav himself was deferential to Shmuel. Rav was deferential to Shmuel. Rav would not walk in through the door before Shmuel would. So how could Rav take the Kohen Aliyah, where there's Shmuel who is a Kohen, and Rav himself is deferential to Shmuel? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. Shmuel nami mekaf avikaya for Rav. The truth is Shmuel was also subservient. In other words, Shmuel was not as great as Rav. The Rav who da'aved leila kavod. Rav was deferential to Shmuel out of kavod to Shmuel, but not because Shmuel was the ranking sage. Rav was actually the ranking sage. But again, Rav in his humility expressed kavod to Shmuel. Now watch this. V'chi avid le b'fanav. Shelo b'fanav lo avid. But when did Rav give kavod to Shmuel? Only where? In Shmuel's presence. But when he wasn't in Shmuel's presence, Rabbi say, as is evident in this story, ultimately he was not deferential to Shmuel, and therefore he was able to take the Kohen Aliyah. Hachinai mistabra dirab b'kanikar. So therefore, Rabbi say, it turns out that Rav is getting the first Aliyah, not the third Aliyah. And the Gemara says, I'll tell you another proof to this. So I'll say, because if you say that he got the Yisrael Aliyah, then remember, what did the story say? When did Rav make a bracha? When did he make a bracha? Before the Aliyah. If he got Yisrael, why is he making a bracha before the Aliyah? The fact that he's making a bracha before the Aliyah indicates to us what? That he's getting the Kohen Aliyah. To which the Gemara says, no, the Acher Takana. We'll say, this ties back to what we started with today. No, when did this story happen? This story happened after the Takana. We'll say, which Takana? Which Takana? The Takana that said it should make a bracha before and after every Aliyah. Well, if that's the case, Ihachi La'achrei Nami Livrach. Why didn't Shmuel make a bracha after the Aliyah? Right, what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, "Shiny heicha diyasiv." Rav, listen to this. Rav's city in Bavel was different. Why? Listen to this. Dima'ayli ayil meifak lo nafki. Rav said, listen to this. People used to habitually come late, but no one ever left early. So I'll say, this is actually fascinating. So it turns out, Rav say that in Rav's locale, what they instituted was an obligation to make an aliyah, a bracha before every aliyah, but you only made a bracha after the last aliyah. Because people came late, people habitually came late. Therefore, you want people to, there's a bracha after every aliyah, before every aliyah, but or you want people to know there is a bracha before an aliyah, but people never left early. Therefore, they always caught the bracha after the last aliyah. So, I just want to point out what's fascinating about this. You begin also to see the sugya we started with today on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis was also like an evolutionary process, right? In the beginning of Kriyas Ezra, there was a bracha before the first aliyah, bracha after the last aliyah. From the sugya on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, it sounds like then they transitioned into what? Bracha before and after every aliyah. But what you're beginning to see is that that's not necessarily, that's kind of where we ended. But it seems to be that the takana was instituted different ways in different places. Like in the locale of Rav, what they first started doing was a bracha before every aliyah, but they only made one bracha after the last aliyah. And then again, somehow later on that evolved again to become what we contemporarily do of a bracha before and after every aliyah. Incredible. So we'll say, point over here is, we still haven't answered our question, which is what? On a tainis tzibor, how many aliyahs? Tashma, zakla, koshi yishpo, bitl malach ali'am, kigon, tainis tzibor, v'tishabav, korin gimel. So we'll say, now the Gemara says, here's the klal. The klal is any day where people have to go to work. Any day where people have to go to work, and if you keep them in shul too long, ultimately, again, there is bitl malacha, a loss of an opportunity to work. For example, tainis tzibor and tishabav. Remember again, Tisha, I want to point out, remember, doing work on Tisha B'Av is dependent on what? Minhag HaMakom. We saw this in Tainis. Minhag HaMakom. Now, the Gemara says, if you work on Tisha B'Av, you're not going to see bracha from that work. But nevertheless, the restriction on work is based on Minhag HaMakom. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, for example, Tainis Tzibor on a fast day, even Tisha B'Av, you could work. Therefore, again, we keep the number of aliyos to 3. But on a day where people aren't working, Kigon is interesting. Rashi Chadashim. So I'll say we'll discuss in just a moment. Rashi Chadashim. B'cholo Shamay Rechalamayid Korin Dalid. We read 4 aliyos. So we'll say shmamina. So we'll say this seems to be pretty explicit over here. Therefore, halacha l'maisa what? Halacha l'maisa we read 3 aliyos on a tinus sibor, and that indeed is the halacha, right? Because we'll say again, and here's these principles are very helpful. Any day where there's bittul malacha, in other words, any day where people have to go to work, we keep kriyas Torah to a minimum, right? 3 aliyos, and that's it. Any day where there is no bittul malacha, ultimately, again, we read 4 aliyos. And I will say now, it's interesting over here that the Gemara said there's no bittul malacha on Rosh Chodesh. So it's something people aren't working on Rosh Chodesh. I'm not going to take a show of hands, right? Who's going to work today? So I'll say, what's the pshat? Take a look at Rashi. This is very interesting. Ein bo bittul malacha kol kach. So it's interesting. Rashi says there's not as much of a bittul malacha. What does this mean? She'in hanashim osos malacha bahem. Because Rosh Chodesh is a yom tov for women, and women don't do work on Rosh Chodesh. What's the pshat? So let's listen to this. V'shamati mipi Moria zakin zal shenitna lahem mitzvah zu b'shvil shelo pirku nizmehen be'egel. We will say, isn't this absolutely beautiful? Ultimately, again, because the women refused to participate in the sin of the golden calf, the men came to them for their jewelry to give to the calf. The women refused, and because of their refusal to participate in the sin of the golden calf, they were rewarded with an extra Yom Tiv, the Yom Tov of Rosh Chodesh. And Rashi actually goes on, quoting Tosafos, "V'anima tzasi parak hey the Bracha Strimber Eliezer shamu anashim v'lo ratzu litin izmeila ba'aleim ela amru lahem atem rotzim lasos pesel u'masecha she'in bo koach lahatzil." The women said to the men, "You want to make an idol? You want to make an idol that has no power to save you?" V'nasna Kadosh Baruch Hu schar shalashim ba'olam hazeh shemishmaros roshei chadashim yoser min ha'anashim ola olam haba. Hinasidos leischadesh k'mo roshei chadashim shneimar tischadesh k'neshim rachavosai. This is absolutely beautiful. Rashi says, according from Tosafos, that what? That women were given a twofold reward for not participating in the Chet Egel. Number one, they were given Rosh Chodesh as a Yom Tiv, and number two, in Olam Haba, women will experience a hischachus, a renewal, unlike men. And again, I will say it's tied to the same thing, because Rosh Chodesh, the greatness of Rosh Chodesh is a renewal. It's a renewal. Ultimately, again, so too in Olam Haba, they are given a renewal, a schachus, unlike men. Such an incredible idea. To which the Gemara says, Shema. Rabbi says there's much more to say about that, but it's 6:27. So again, but I want to point out, it's why Rosh Chodesh? In other words, why are they given Rosh Chodesh for Chet Egel? Alright, hopefully we'll have a few minutes tomorrow, we'll talk about that more. Shema Mira. So we'll say, so therefore, again, Allah Chalaisa, fast day, 4 aliyahs. Done. Amravashi, Vaha Anan Lo Tanan Hachi, but we have a different version of this. Ze'aklal, Kol Yom Shiyish, B'Mosav Ve'ino Yom Tiv. Any day that has Musaf, but it's not a Yom Tiv, Koran Arba. We supposed to say, an example of that would be Rosh Chodesh. We read 4 aliyahs. La Suye Mai, what does that come to include? Lav La Asuye, Tainus Sibur, V'Tisha B'Av. Doesn't that also come to include a Tainus Sibur, a fast day, which Rabbi says is a day that's not a Yom Tiv, but has Musaf. Now, Rabbi understand, when the Gemara says that a Tainus Sibur has Musaf, what does it mean? It has additional tfilos. So, right, and yet it says, you read 4 aliyos. Or Ravashi mas nisin mani. According to Ravashi, whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? Lo Tanakama v'lo Rabbi Yossi disanyo chalios b'sheni v'chamishi. Right, chalios b'sheni v'chamishi. If it falls out on a Monday or a Thursday, Korin Gimel. Ultimately, again, we read 3 aliyos. Umaftir echad. And umaftir echad, right? And that last aliyah ultimately is maftir. B'shlishi b'revi. If Tishba falls out on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, listen to this. Korin echad. When we read 1 aliyah, umaftir echad, and that aliyah is also maftir. Rabbi Yossi says no. The olam korin gimel umaftir echad. No, we always read 3 aliyahs and 1 is maftir. V'alakashya ze'aklal. But what do you do with what we just said before? The Brisa, the Mishnah, that said ze'aklal. This is the rule. So which the Gemara said lo la'asuye rosh chodesh lo la'asuye rosh chodesh umoid. Isn't that coming to include rosh chodesh and chalamayid? No, that's explicit. To which the Gemara said, ultimately, again, there are Rosh Chodesh and Chalamayid. Ultimately, again, you read 4. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Simna ba'alma yahiv. Ultimately, again, I will say that idea of Rashi says, or Simna Ba'alma, Hadar Nakit Le Bezak Klal Simliyav. Both say Zak Klal is not coming to include anything additional. Zak Klal is just a way to remember. The switch the Gemara says, Simna Ba'alma Yav, Dilotema Yom Tov Dilotema Yom Tov V'cholo Shamoid Kiad Dadininu. Both say a person should not think that Yom Tov and Cholamoid are the same. You might have thought that Yom Tov is the same thing as Cholamoid. Kamash Bolon, that they are different. Elanakit Hai Klala Biyadach. Rabbi say, here's the call, with this will stop. Kol de Tafile Milsa Mechavre, Tafile Gavri Yisira. Any day that has an additional dimension beyond its fellow has an additional aliyah. Therefore, Hilchach, so therefore we'll say, what's the baseline? The baseline is what? Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, Mincha. And that baseline, therefore, is 3 aliyos. Therefore, Rosh Chodesh, Moed, Diika Karba Mosaf, Rosh Chodesh, Cholamay, Shabbat Karba Mosaf, Koran Arba, you read an additional aliyah, 4 aliyahs. B'Yam Tiv, Dasar B'Asiyas Malacha, on Yom Tiv, where there's an Isra Malacha, an additional aliyah, 5 aliyos. B'Yom Kippur, Danash Kares, Yom Kippur, which has an additional dimension of a Chi of Kares, Shisha, 6 aliyos. Shabbos, Diika, Isra Skila, Shiva, and Shabbos, which is more common, that has an Isra Skila, ultimately 7 aliyos. And I will say, now again, so what you see over here is you have a number of competing things happening over here. This is the klal. So I will say, baseline, 3 aliyos. Monday, Thursday, Shabbos, Mincha. You have something additional, Karban Musaf, Rosh Chodesh, Chalamayid, ultimately 4. Yom Tiv, Isra Malacha, 5. Shabbos, Isra Skila, Yom Kippur, Isra Kares, 6. Shabbos, Isra Skila, 7. But Abba said what also contributes to this is what? Any day where there's bittul malacha, any day where you could work, we're always going to keep the number of aliyos to a minimum of 3. Any day where there is no Isra Malacha, or where there isn't Isra Malacha, you can't work, we'll expand the number of aliyos. So Abba said we're going to continue with this tomorrow. Stop over here today. Shkayach everyone.